Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My own is an observation and a question. Madam Nominee, as impressive as your resume is it not? It's not accompanied by any credential whatsoever. Is this an oversight or think it's not necessary? Then my question is, what is your honest assessment of the Girl Child Initiative education in Nigeria?
Amina, you take questions. The question was Walker.
Yes, thank you. Distinguished Senator, on the question of the stock market and investors' confidence, I think that the thrust that the President has taken in terms of dealing with perceptions of the country, with security, with governance, and with infrastructure are the right ones to try to bring that back again. I believe that that's really been the bane of many of the international discussions that have been had, is that can one bring in their resources and guarantee their safety over time? Also, if investments are to be made in any infrastructure, how can that begin if to begin with we don't have the power? So I think investor confidence is what we need to deal with and what the key issues are around that. The question from the distinguished senator on the MDGs and the conditional grants to states. There was criteria that was agreed with states and was agreed with this hallowed chamber and the Federal House of Assembly when we came to give conditional grants. There were two major concerns. One was that could these resources be given to states and be utilized to get results? And governance was a very big question at that time. The criteria that we put in place, in many cases, the capacity of states to meet that criteria was not there. And over time, we tried to build that. And if you look at the records of the states that we did give conditional grants to, remembering that the conditional grants were leveraging the equal amount from state domestic resources as well, you'll find that over time that increased around all states. But where a state was unable to produce documentation, unable to produce a plan or the capacity to implement, it was not possible to give resources to that, just purely because at the end of the day we have to remain accountable for those resources that we got appropriated by the federal government. I believe that going forward, if we are to pursue the conditional grant scheme, it is a good scheme. It is a scheme where the federal, the states and the local governments come together behind one policy. If it's delivering education, it's delivering health, and this way the synergy and the coherence of what we do would be, I think, advantageous. What I would say is that we need far more resources running in the same direction. We had many instances where there are conflicts of interest as to who takes the credit for what resources come to a state or a local government. There has to be better synergy around the basic service delivery. Noting that the MDGs really did only focus on basic services of health, of water, and of education. Giving an overview of the SDGs to Senator Adeleke, the SDGs are the successor framework to the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals that were set in 2000 were basically addressing the social agenda. There were 8 of those goals that started off looking at poverty, the gender agenda, health, water, environment, partnerships, and then education. Those goals, we learned many lessons from the way in which we invested in them. The new agenda has taken 3.5 years for 193 countries to agree. One of the things we learned from the MDGs is there was no ownership. When they came to this National Assembly, one of the things you all asked was, where did this come from? Well, the United Nations framed the new one with the intervention of...
Distinguished colleague, there's too much noise. Can we please yes, keep this as quiet so we can...
Please. Senator Bino Melaye, thank you for taking your seat. Senator Deputy Speaker, please take your seat. Senator John Eno, please don't disturb the Deputy Speaker. Thank you very much, distinguished colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, in essence, the difference between the Sustainable Development Goals and the MDGs is that the approach is different. We are now addressing the social, the economic, and the environmental aspects of development. That we're not just talking about fixing the health system or education, but that you're asking what you invest in your economy has results that deliver services, health, education, water, the well-being of people, but they also take into account that we do have very real issues in the environment, and that is around climate change. Climate change, where evidence shows us that as countries are growing and industrializing, the emissions that we get from fossil fuels, and in particular Nigeria, it's not sustainable. And so therefore, if we, Nigeria now, are to industrialize, are to look at the value chains, whether they're manufacturing or they are agriculture, then we will have to take that into consideration. The 17 SDGs are a response to 193 countries, Nigeria included, where we acknowledged what were the issues that we have to face. I think even when we do our planning in Nigeria, to agree as a country what the major issues are. Inequality, poverty, the conflict, migration, youth unemployment, the issue of women and access to resources were all the backdrop of what was agreed. The 17 goals themselves deal with finishing off the MDGs. They also deal with the economy, the environment, and then two incredibly important aspects. One is governance, the rule of law, corruption, and institutions. I think this is a critical issue that we discussed for over a year and a half in the United Nations, with many who believe that without it, no matter what the goals, you cannot deliver if your institutions are not strong, they're not credible, and there are no checks and balances for corruption. Corruption is a symptom of just a basically poor structure, institutions, and a lack of capacity. The 17th goal, which is the other one that holds up these 15, is basically partnerships. The question about the stock markets is that we need partnerships to develop this country. The domestic resources will always remain critical, and that which sustains the daily investments that we need to make in our economy. But we will need partnerships to grow them, whether they come from the private sector, they come from other donors, or they come from instances of the insurance world and other private equity. That framework was built around, the finance framework was agreed in Addis Ababa for the 17 goals. With the Millennium Development Goals, we did not have a financing framework, but the world has agreed that if we're to do these goals, the resources have to be there. In addition to the monetary resources of finances that we need, we have acknowledged that technology is going to be a key to making this happen. We are beneficiaries of technology. We also know that in the health sector, for instance, it has worked incredibly well in getting at rural people who need healthcare services using the cell phone to make sure that that happens. And I think that here, that was the third part of what we did with the SDGs. The last part of this has been accountability. Accountability around the world is what people are asking for. We had a survey that we conducted around the world. 8 million people responded. Out of the 8 million people, over 2.5 million of those responses came from Nigeria. And when Nigerians were asked what it was they wanted for the new development agenda, they cited 4 things: education, health, jobs, and a responsive government. And this has gone across the world. So really this agenda is responding to that. That really is basically it. How does Nigeria benefit from this? What we do not want to happen this time that is different from the MDGs is that the SDG framework must be integrated into Nigeria's plan. We have to have a vision and a longer-term plan. Senator Binta Garba Masai had said to us that what were we doing about planning? We have had plans, and some of them have not been as robust as we need to respond to the issues that we have. But we do have Vision 2020. That is a plan that was a national one. It needs upgrading, it needs to respond to the current times, but the SDGs should be integrated into that plan and not an SDG plan at the side. So one would hope that that happens. But with every plan and whatever we do integrating it, what we are suffering from these days to know where to go, where the issues are. I noted from the distinguished senators the issue of whether you had lopsided investments. The baseline data for this country is really not available. And unless
that
Thank you.
Honorable.